All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. I Mix What I Like.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Joining us once again is Netfa Freeman, who is a veteran activist, journalist, co-host of the extremely important and long-running show Voices with Vision, not for the politically faint of heart, which airs on DC's WPFW 89.3 FM, WPFW.org. And he is also an organizer with PACA, Pan-African Community Action. And we want to welcome him back once again, specifically to talk about a recent piece he's written for Black Agenda Report called Clearing the Smoke and Mirrors Around Zimbabwe. Netfa Freeman, welcome back to the show. Thanks again.
Thank you, brother. Always a pleasure and an honor.
No, man, honor's mine, man, definitely. Let me just, I wanted to start this way, though, before we get into the details of your article and the issue of Zimbabwe itself. But I wanted to start with you telling us first why you think it's important for the diaspora to be concerned with Zimbabwe. Why should we care about this issue at all, especially given that it gets almost no coverage in the mainstream press, little to none in what claims to be the alternative press, and is, of course, taking place in, on the continent of Africa. So why should we in the diaspora care? Why should Black America care or anyone else care about the issue of Zimbabwe?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we should care about the issue of everything that's going on in the continent and the African world because it tells us our disposition in the world. I mean, that affects us as Black people, as African people in one place always affects us in another. I mean, this is a global world, and the adversaries, the enemies that profit and benefit off of our exploitation are unified in how they deal with us. And so, I mean, for just a quick example, there's Program 1033, which authorizes the giving of the transfer of military equipment and whatnot to police departments, to police forces in the United States, is tantamount to the same of the AFRICOM program, the African Command, U.S. African Command, which is seeking to control and militarize the continent of Africa and our people. And so that's just one reason. Two, I think in Zimbabwe in particular, so I just think we're interconnected world. African people are interconnected. Like Marcus Garvey said, one God, one aim, one destiny. But in Zimbabwe in particular, it is one of only two at this point, now that Libya is not in the mix, of a stronghold against imperialism, the other one being Eritrea. And so what's happening there should be of great concern for us because then, we don't have a base, where we can actually look at this standing up against imperialism on the continent of Africa, and also should be able to connect with those of us here who are struggling for liberation.
Yeah, I might want to come back, because let me just follow up real quick because I don't want to belabor this too much, but I think it is important. It's something that I see folks struggling with in a variety of places. But maybe even for somebody who doesn't even necessarily see themselves in this Pan-African way of being an African outside of the continent, or someone who's connected almost entirely to Democratic Party politics or something like that. How do you, just quickly out of curiosity, almost more than anything else, how do you address them, or do you at all? But, or how would you encourage that they approach this issue if they haven't already accepted this Pan-African outlook and have not already accepted that the United States is even part of an imperial process against which Zimbabwe is one of the last remaining strongholds?
That's interesting. So I guess the first thing that comes to mind when you say your question is it's a lesson on propaganda and demonizing of our people and around the world. So if we look at the dominant narrative when Zimbabwe is covered, we really get a completely different picture of what actually is taking place in terms of the complexity and the context of things. The general narrative is that, let's just take for what's happened recently, for example, is that the change of a coup took place in Zimbabwe, and it was a result of people being dissatisfied and the infighting among the elites and people being dissatisfied at the mismanagement of Mugabe. And they always focus on the individual who's been this dictator reigning for 37 years over the country, and that's about it. And his wife, this woman who's angling, younger than him, angling to actually be his successor. These are the kind of narratives we hear. It's an oversimplification of issues. So in fact, if we look at really what's happening, we can see that when Africa is covered, they really don't we don't have an accurate picture of what's happening. And then also we can be hoodwinked into supporting policies against our own sisters and brothers, our own kith and kin on the continent that are really designed to destabilize and overthrow and create misery in places around the world that we just really have no business participating and being accomplices in terms of U.S. exploits around the world.
So just sort of, again, one more preamble question before we get to the specifics of this most recent issue or set of issues. What is Zimbabwe's role or relationship to Western imperialism? Both now and going back to its independence or from official colonial rule. Because I kind of, again, want to set the context a little bit for the conversation we're about to have with that. So again, what is that relationship historically, or and then also now?
Okay, so I'm gonna have to do a little quick history lesson on this one because it could be kind of complicated. But suffice it to say, Zimbabwe is in the southern part of Africa, and it was one of many of the frontline states that were settler colonized. And people might remember North Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, South Rhodesia now being Zimbabwe, North Rhodesia being Zambia. Our people's struggle there against settler colonialism. We're talking about settler colonialism, same thing that is stricken South Africa. Many people are familiar more with South Africa and apartheid in South Africa, where white settlers came and dominated and occupied the land as if it were their own, as opposed to traditional colonialism where they rule from some mother country and just really exploiting that resources and everything. They actually occupied the land, and we're talking way hundreds of years ago. And so fast forward into a liberation struggle that starts in the 1900s, mid 1900s, or even early 1900s, where our people found no choice but to wage arms, to get arms and to fight for their liberation. At some point, even Rhodesia, as it was called, named after Cecil Rhodes, became a protectorate of Britain. And so you could say that, and even all the settlers came from there, from Britain and from the Dutch, and all those settled there to occupy the land. In the liberation struggle, I'm gonna have to do a quick one.
No, I know this is an oversimplification of hundreds of years of struggle, obviously. Right. But I do think it's important for people to understand, to the extent that they don't already, this history, because it is everything about what's going on, or what we think is going on in Zimbabwe now, and how it's discussed.
Mm-hmm. And what emerged were, in the most pointed aspects of the struggle, were two prominent liberation forces within Zimbabwe: Zimbabwe African National Union, and ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union, I think. And so they were the two prominent ones. They fought. Let's fast forward to like 1979, around 79. And this was a long, very vicious armed struggle. They forced Britain and others and the Rhodesians to sit down, or the Rhodes as they call them, or to sit down at the negotiation table. So that was on our part. And also, you could say that the other what we call frontline states, who are also engaged in their also battles against settler colonialism, imperialism, encouraged Zimbabwe to encourage the forces ZANU-PF. It wasn't ZANU-PF yet. I keep saying that. And ZAPU to sit down on the negotiation table. ZANU led by Robert Mugabe, and ZAPU led by Joshua Nkomo. And so then, so they sat down. They did what was called the Lancaster House Accords. People should look up the Lancaster House Agreements, which set the tone for their independence, for them to actually take over, for Africans to take over Zimbabwe and rule it, and so in the Lancaster House Accords, there was a number of, agreements. It's a negotiation. We can't go into all of that, but it sets the tone. One of the sticking points in the liberation struggle was land. And traditionally, the settlers, or not traditionally, before the settlers had occupied, they're a minority in the country, but they're occupying the majority of the most arable land, the majority land period, and the most arable, meaning useful for agriculture and everything. And so the largest negotiation point in that struggle was over the land, redistributing the land in a fair and equitable way. And then so that some process of this started happening. And Zimbabwe also was very prominent in terms of exports of agricultural products. And so during the Lancaster House Accords, they negotiated having rule of the country and negotiated how a land redistribution process will go in that land. And this is in 1980, 1979, 1980. 1980 was the Declaration of Independence. And U.S. was at the table, namely Jimmy Carter and some other people representing the UK. And one was that they would, that our position, or African position, I identify with being we have to recompensate these white farmers because they stole the land in the first place. So the concession was that Britain and the U.S. were supposed to compensate the farmers to get paid them for their land, whatnot, and we didn't have to do that. So some redistribution happened. Fast forward throughout from 1980 until 1990, Zimbabwe's was pretty much a socialist program was flourishing, having a whole lot of success and providing universal health care, universal education, being what was even known as the breadbasket of Africa, because it was able to export and be very prosperous in a lot of ways. During when fast forward to 1989, one of the largest, and they also created relationships with the Eastern Bloc. So bring in the dynamics or the influence of what was the Cold War in this, because also one of the things was the West didn't like the influence of the Soviet Union with their peer influence and the spreading of communism, et cetera, et cetera. But with the assistance of the Soviet Union, a lot of the liberation movements around the world were found, some fertile ground. They found trading partners in the Soviet Union and also other kind of assistance. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, what John, what's his name, John Perkins refers to in his books, the economic hitmen went out and saw the weak spots in the different developing countries and tried to sell neoliberalism to them. They were vulnerable at that point, a little bit more vulnerable. Not a little bit, a lot more vulnerable. And so they went on the assault. Zimbabwe, as a result, and they weren't alone, capitulated to accepting the machinations of the IMF and the World Bank. And they took loans from the IMF and the World Bank because their economy was being affected by this collapse in the Soviet Union. And along with the IMF and World Bank loans come what they call structural adjustment programs, economic structural adjustment programs, which require countries to do things like put caps on their wages, bring in foreign investment, put user fees on things that were and privatize certain things that were had traditionally been universal and public goods like healthcare and education, things like that. This had immediate messed up effect on the country. It spiraled the country out of control, in terms of economy, and people were suffering as a result of these things. Now, throughout, this is 1990, from 1990 to 1999, let's say, while this was happening, also people were dissatisfied with the slowness of the land redistribution and what seemed to be even a further entrenchment of white settlers' power in the country. And so these two things, while ZANU-PF, now, mind you, ZANU-PF also, now ZANU-PF, I didn't get to that, but ZAPU and ZANU made a united front and became ZANU-PF, Patriotic Front, PF. And so now they're one party ruling the country. And people should understand that, because imperialism goes back to this discrepancy that they had back in, right after independence in the early 80s, where there was what was really tantamount to a civil war. And there was a lot of casualties and people died. And wholly, that's usually characterized as this massacre by ZANU. But it's more complicated than that. And I'm not saying no atrocities occurred or anything like that, but it's always oversimplified in the Western media, and even civilians. Obviously, civilians died. And I can never pronounce the area, Metabebele or something. I can't remember exactly. But anyway, what's important about that is that since then, those two parties have united and have become ZANU-PF and have been governing the country. Now, during this time,
the ruling party that Mugabe has been in charge of for almost 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
That is now, by some accounts, coming apart, fracturing into more argument, disagreement, and vying for power, etc. Which is for some of the reports where we are now. So what is it that's actually happening, as best as you can assess? And then, what is happening, and then how should we be interpreting it, and looking to engage or react to it?
Right. So I should make it a little shorter, but I have to say at the end of what I was trying to recount is that in 2000, from 2000 on to now, roughly 2000, and some things happened. Two major things happened. One is that as a result of the dissatisfaction of the people about land redistribution, the government, ZANU-PF, initiated a fast-track land redistribution process. And so they started taking the land from the white farmers and saying, we don't have any responsibility we never did have a responsibility to recompensate you, and we need to redistribute this land, and then the other thing that happened was that they jettisoned the structural adjustment programs of the IMF and the World Bank. These are two major things that the West was like, wait a minute now, and so they said they weren't playing ball anymore. So this is an admirable thing on the part of this party. People will argue all the details about how and why, but it doesn't matter. The fact is, it was good things that happened. It's a stand against imperialism. And so from now, to get to your question,
real quick, in fact, for some, myself included, at the time in the early 2000s, there was the question being raised, was the reclamation of land from white farmers going far enough? And there was even a sense for some that it was only the smaller white farms that were being reclaimed. And in fact, in the one trip that I was a part of in 2002, I asked, sort of off the record, one of Mugabe's aides and top officials, why weren't they going after some of the larger,
like Oppenheimer
and all those, that have huge plots of land. And the quote is sort of haunted me ever since, where he said, we can't do that because they could, quote, whisper the demise of our economy. And what I've always thought about that, whatever people have argued about where they came down on, is Mugabe right or wrong, or how should we support Mugabe or not, that quote has always led my response, which is, well, if Mugabe's leadership knows that white farmers can whisper the demise of the economy, the larger industrialists, them specifically, then that suggests that Mugabe and his people and African people are not really in charge and don't have the full reins of power that you would maybe associate with a sovereign nation. But anyway.
Right. I mean, that's a good point. And I think this is also gets to your earlier question about what lessons it has for us and the rest of the world when we're trying to, rid ourselves of the clutches of imperialism and colonialism. This is a global economy that's interconnected in so many complicated ways. I think in that sense, what you raise is almost an unfair judgment to say whether it has gone far enough or not, because if we were sitting in that seat, what kind of decisions will we be making? It can't be just a blanket, all force, everything be fast track, because the repercussions come. It's these are strategic and it has to be handled strategically and tactically. And so these are the kind of things that I think are not considered when people are, a lot of people, particularly on the liberal left, when they claim that they're for when they, that they're not considering. And so, but there is something to be said about how, when and how you do, how long do you, tolerate some kind of thing. And so that's an interesting thing. So now we have not just sanctions by the US, but by the whole European Union, by the UK, and then and also the creation of parties like the Movement for Democratic Change, which is prominent now as an opposition party, wholly supported by the West, even a creation of the West. And through the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, that's a complicated history. People should know that when you're talking about the Movement for Democratic Change, you're talking about a party that's beholden. They get hundreds of millions of dollars from the West, and they're beholden to that. They want to bring in that whole liberal agenda of how to run the economy.
And sorry to interrupt once again, but I just want to supplement that by at least from my experience and the it's been a while, but the firsthand experience that we had is that this is not controversial what you're saying about the MDC, that they openly admit it, that there's no they're saying, yes, we get funded from outside sources, right. And then they say these are the politics that we want to instill in Zimbabwe. And yeah, so I just wanted to say it's not like you're I don't even. Yeah. Anyway, just wanted to.
Right. It's not wild. It's open. It's an open book. Although it's also couched in a whole lot of other propaganda. I mean, propaganda. You could argue if it's true or not, as being the dictatorship and them being, all that kind of stuff. But it's a parliamentary government. They have elections, and they are open and have been deemed credible elections. I can't speak for the latest election in 2013. That was one I wasn't, paying a lot of attention to at that time, but I even paid a lot of attention to 2008 and even wrote about it. And while they were condemned as ZANU-PF and whatnot was condemned as trying to manipulate the elections, it was actually the opposite. The West hand was all up in it, trying to tip things in the favor for MDC. It was actually they really tried a whole lot of scandalous things in terms of that, and that had a whole lot of stuff to it. But fast forward all the way up to now, what we're seeing, and so some of the people, let me put this about the sanctions. The sanctions sanctions in any country by the U.S. are largely thought of as economic strangulation. So they put restrictions on trade and how they interact with international financial institutions, which is exactly how they strangle countries. But what's not known is that in most sanctions, including, like, for example, U.S. sanctions against Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe Economic and Recovery, Democracy and Recovery Act, this hypocritical name, it also allocates money for things like they call media, independent media, and human rights groups and democracy programs, as they call it. So what they're doing is co-opting the citizens of a country to work on behalf of the West in the guise of doing so quote unquote human rights and activism work. And U.S. taxpayers' dollars go to that. There are actually laws enshrined and approved by U.S. Congress, by the Parliament in Britain and whatnot. And so when you have people, and I want to just bring this up, and I'm not trying to it's an example. Our brother Bill Fletcher had a show on his Arise, and we were on the same station, and he was talking about Zimbabwe. It just came up, but one of his guests was a consultant for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Well, the USAID is the agency that they use when they want to allocate these funds to the media and for media development and democracy and whatnot. So obviously this consultant, this person who's a consultant for it and also whatever else he does, is more coming from the interest of Western analysis, Western perspective. So we got to understand these kind of things. This is how they actually disseminate propaganda. A large part of the sanctions are how they enforce the propaganda and the narrative that goes around the world and our perception of what's happening in a given country.
And by the way, if we were to continue to look for those comparisons and as to why an understanding of what's happening in Zimbabwe is important to an understanding of what's happening in our own lives here in this country and other parts of the world, We just have to look at the way revolutionary activity is siphoned off through the nonprofit industrial complex.
Right.
Or other, government institutions through funding and through punditry and through resources allocated to those spaces and figures. So it's the same exact kind of process.
Same thing. And it's actually very insidious and what you call, not insidious, incestuous. Incestuous.
Both work, insidious and incestuous.
Right. And so they work together, through these non-governmental organizations and whatnot. A perfect example would be how the U.S. State Department is a funder of the AFL-CIO, who has an international arm called the Solidarity Center that works directly with the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, and then we're seen as, they're trying to support labor movement. That's a just, admirable cause, labor and the cause of labor, but where they're actually doing the State Department is not, and the U.S. is not in the habit of doling out funds for anything that's going to be anti-imperialist or self-determination or anything. But I'm trying to really work up to your question about what's happening.
I set you up in many ways because I asked you a very difficult, I put you in a very difficult position. But again, and I know we're slowly getting there, but I just can't help but think that this is really important because so much of the conversation I've been seeing over the last couple of weeks since these most recent events have occurred in Zimbabwe has been extremely limited, both on both sides, so-called both sides of the conversation, even among so-called alternative and radical spaces. It's been a very limited, narrow conversation that I think has further, in many ways, confused the issue. So I at least appreciate what we're trying to do here, and what I'm asking you to do more specifically in building up to what's happening right now. But anyway, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. And so ZANU-PF has had to fend off this type of machinations inside the country. And at the same time, these kind of machinations and what happens, and then also the fact that you have new generations who are not always as privy to all of this history. They have in Zimbabwe and a lot of what they call the born free generation. So they're adults now, but they don't know what happened with the liberation struggle aside from what they're taught or what what's heard. And so
again, I got to say one more thing that we can compare to what's happening now, where a lot of people, the so-called millennials and the Black Lives Matter generation, are having to find new ways to struggle, having been so-called born free and disconnected from our most recent and radical revolutionary efforts in this country. And that has caused, I would have to say, its own level of confusion.
That's right.
Anyway, go ahead.
So the difficulty is, not just this, there's a really good article I want to recommend by Gregory Elich. And he wrote an article called "What's Behind the Coup in Zimbabwe?" It's in Counterpunch. If the viewers would actually go to that article, that will give more details about what an account of what took place in this recent change of power that we have time to give here. And then if you want to, read the article I wrote. Clearing the Smoke and Mirrors around Zimbabwe. The two articles are not really overlapping. They actually taken a, not separate thing, but he focused more on the details of what took place, on what unfolded in the transfer of power. And I'm mostly focusing on how the media works and spins this stuff, and the fact that the sanctions are a large part of what they are blaming on the effect of the sanctions economically.
And again, what I appreciate about what you did is that you're also critiquing not, again, just the mainstream press, which is too easy. It's easy to critique CNN and MSNBC and Fox. It's a critique of also the left or the alternative with Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman and some others, and even Bill Fletcher, colleague at WPFW. So, it's the problem, if I could describe it that way, of understanding this, is something that needs to be critiqued going into the left and so-called alternative spaces as well. Again, I appreciate about what you were doing in your piece there.
Well, thank you. And that brings to mind that we should raise up that some of the misnomers, the myths that are going around, like, they've been put out a lot in the left, and also that it's almost the same narrative that the West puts out in general, the more farther right, is things like the land redistribution program was largely to the cronies of Mugabe. They always use Mugabe and don't just say ZANU-PF, but they'll say that sometime, and that it was not successful. It spiraled the economy into the despair, those kind of things. And those are like proven false. And people should look up the study that was done led by this person in Sussex University. It was in their department called the Institute for Economic Development in Sussex University. A guy named Ian Scoons and some other Zimbabweans studied the land reform program in particular. And they went there and they did some case studies and all this kind of stuff, and found that it was actually the opposite. The land reform program was having quite a lot of successes. While there might have been some mismanagement and some cronyism going on, that was like a small, almost insignificant part of what took place there. And farmers were actually empowered and being able to even turn them, produce enough not only to feed themselves but to sell it, different things like that. And that while they're focused, this is the red herring here. Sometimes they focus on the inability of a country to not export something, when in fact sometimes their agricultural production can be used internally to help with goods that actually feed people and do things. And so they were finding that those were largely some of the things that were happening, as opposed to exports that, that help your quote unquote GDP, And so anyway, so that was some of those misnomers. And then the last thing, let's get to your question now.
Well, just real quick, I want to remind people that when they go to your piece of Black Agenda, they'll find that you cover and dispel how media address these so-called myths, or the five in particular: land reform being a failure, that the beneficiaries were only cronies, that there is no investment in new resettlements, that agriculture is in complete ruins, creating a chronic food insecurity, and that the rural economy has collapsed. You show how all of these are myths promoted to justify a critique or a call for a removal of Mugabe, if not the entire ruling party. But go ahead.
Yeah. And I have to be humble and say that I don't really do that. Actually, I lifted that right from the study that I'm referring to, which is hyperlinked in the article. And so those myths are dispelled by them, and I'm just like, quoting what they put as a part of the article on the study. But yeah. And so now to really talk about, and this is where Greg Elich's article unpacks some of the stuff. Nowhere can we see that, especially with a country and has people having to rule a country, or in any movement, can there not be splits and differences of opinion? And even as we talked about, even what we might say, how I'll refer to it as some ideological erosions. So where we have revolutionary principles at hand, like in places like Cuba, where revolutionary principles are very strong, even among the young generation, it's more of a struggle in Zimbabwe. They were forced by the Lancaster House Agreement to adopt the parliamentary system of multi-parties, which is supposed to be more democratic, but really is a way for the West to come in and manipulate things. And then also they're a landlocked country within Africa. There's a whole being it's 1980 when they got their independence, imperialism had a whole lot of practice on how to undermine countries by that time, and how to inject certain ideas that make things more contentious than they normally would be if we just were able to be unfettered and rule on our own. So you have a faction called the G40 faction, stands for Generation 40, within ZANU-PF, and then the other group is called the Lakosa.
Which is led by Grace Mugabe.
Which is led by Grace Mugabe, the wife of President Mugabe, but also she has a title in the government, and I'm blanking on it. Oh gosh, I can't remember now. But anyway, then the other was the older guard within ZANU-PF, largely dominated by the people who've been in the liberation struggle and those forces. And it seems that one of the people in the G40, also one of them, Jonathan Moyo, who's a ZANU-PF member, but was not originally part of the party, was more a later member of the party, exposed or claimed to have exposed a plot through of the La Costa group, and all of them vying for power and favor with Robert Mugabe, a plot for them to take over. He said that they were concerned about his deteriorating health and his mental faculties and whatnot, which is, I mean, some people want to say, raise him up, but I mean, you can't be 93 years old and not have some kind of, something. You got, and
some might say you can't be 46 and have something.
Right. So maybe that's a concern. Maybe it's legitimate, what have you. But and also the fact that the sanctions were taking their toll. People have differences on how, what should be their approach and whatnot. What was to my surprise, and because I had not been following, admittedly, Zimbabwe since for a while, like 2010 or something, because I just got distracted with other stuff. That it was the older guard, the La Costa group, that seemed to be more leaning toward working with the West and opening up dialogue with MDC and whatnot. You were to think that maybe the younger people who might not have as much experience and with the track record of neoliberalism and the interest of imperialism, but I don't really know what their interests were. I don't know if that's the basis of the problem, but it seems like, of the differences. But it seemed like the older guard and what we're seeing right now, to me, does just not necessarily look good, because as people might know by now, Mugabe was compelled, whether we say forced or whether decided, whatever, to resign under conditions that really, don't really look very. It's concerning. It's concerning how that was happening.
Because some people, there was some this wanting to dispute whether this was a coup or not, but it didn't certainly look like this was voluntary, and it didn't look like this was without the threat of military force. But at the same time,
the sticking point for whether we define it as a coup or not is whether it's constitutional, whether it's provisions in the law for such a thing, and there was not, obviously. But
at the same time, as you point out, this does not necessarily mean that this is a counter-revolutionary move, and it does not necessarily mean that the MDC style Western form has taken over. But at the same time, and it certainly also doesn't mean that everybody is against it.
Right.
The people in the streets, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's another thing with the West. We got to be careful, because people are seeing all these demonstrations, all these people in Harare saying Mugabe's timing for him to go, on these signs. No one's really asking the question where they got these nice, really professionally made signs so quickly. But also,
and just in terms of recent history, or not that long ago history, we have unequivocal, undisputed evidence now that it was the Rand Corporation that created the whole Saddam Hussein statue event. So we can't be unaware that these things go on.
Right, and they have support. And what people need to know, basically in the urban areas, and particularly in Harare, that's largely where the MDC support is. And the young people there. So it's really easy for them to mobilize a whole lot of people. And
I'm sorry again, but to go back where we started, it's also very easy to have a move like that be successful if in fact that's what happened, because so many of us outside of the area or outside of an insistent focus on this have no real idea what's going on. Most people who hear about Zimbabwe are hearing about it for the first time, or very, very, hear about it very infrequently at all.
Exactly.
So you could tell them anything.
You can tell them anything, and they're and visuals and everything really would capture people. So you see the visuals, you're not thinking about one, and then just to add this last point on to the MDCs in the rural areas, and they can mobilize lots of people quickly. The support for ZANU-PF, and particularly Mugabe, is in the I'm sorry, I meant to say the urban areas is where MDC support is. Right. Rural areas are where Mugabe's largely support is, outside of Harare, and where people benefited mostly from land reform. And then people are spread out. It's not really easy to get a whole bunch of people together for a demonstration, and they didn't go there anyway. So we don't know really what, aside from maybe putting the microphone in a few people's face and saying. And we also would not know more complex issues why they might. Some people might favor and be okay with Mugabe having been stepped down, maybe because they think he's old or whatever, but it does not mean that they're anti-ZANU-PF, and it does not mean that they had some of the disparaging, viewpoints or perspective about ZANU-PF that we're led to believe that people had.
But at the same time, we're also hearing that the new leadership is perhaps already installing programs that are,
unfortunately, that's what's
are walking away from the revolutionary achievements under Mugabe and under the revolution itself. So as we sort of move towards wrapping up, tell us who is now in charge, and what does it look like? First of all, who is it? And then what does it look like they are intending to have happen here? Right.
And so it's so there was it's apparent a change of power. Mugabe was expelled from the party, and also he resigned. I won't say for whatever happened, he resigned, and apparently not, it wasn't seemingly initially willing, something he did of his own will. And who took his place now is Emerson Mnangagwa. And he was one of the vice presidents under ZANU-PF, under Mugabe. And so he was the person who was being accused of wanting to lead a faction that was largely the liberation forces and the culture group, and also a lot of support in the military. And so now he's in charge, and they're getting ready for elections in 2018. Actually, today was the day. Soon they'll be having their party congress this Friday coming up. But he's in charge, and also have replaced a lot of the people that in one faction of the ZANU-PF that was supported by Grace Mugabe have been expelled from the party. And whatnot. Some people have been in prison. I don't know if they still are. They might not be. But they're expelled from the party. And so the decision to expel Mugabe was not something that they weren't included in that decision, because a lot of them were in hiding when it was happening. And so that now we're seeing like the West overtures. Britain has come and paid visit with them. We're seeing the U.S. ambassador to Zimbabwe, who I'm blanking on his name, was of course an African. I shouldn't say of course, because the previous guy was white. Praising the new dispensation and hoping that they go forward with things, and talking about lifting the sanctions. They're saying, in fact, the British person said that most of the sanctions are lifted, with the exception, this is what they're claiming, with the exception of some sanctions on individuals, their finance. They're hoping they will start this recovery. We're seeing reports that they have, the leadership there is also looking at canceling their support for the parastatals. Parastatals are like they're like largely government operated, like corporations or agency ventures, but they're not really completely government, but they're heavily subsidized and whatnot, like transportation companies and different things and so they're talking about, because of, and this is a neoliberal type analysis, because if they're basing the success of these things on a profit, motive. In other words, they're not yielding profits. They're not bringing in things because of people are not, they don't have incentive to do well. They're not performing well, so to speak. And so people are reaping benefits, bonuses, and salaries, and they're not really providing. That's a neoliberal paradigm. Whereas if you're looking at a socialist country, you might have an agency, even if it's not, for example, you have in the U.S. or any socialist country, you subsidize or you actually pay for the building of a road or something like that, or you pay for the existence of a service. And even if it's not yielding up any kind of return from like fees or anything like that, you keep it because it's a benefit to the society as a whole. You don't judge it based on capitalist principles, whether it's a profit or not. And so these things are concerning. These are preludes. When they say they're not going to support them anymore, that means that these things only recourse is to be privatized, and for them to, and this is the neoliberal agenda. And so in some reports, they actually say that's what they're suggesting, privatization. And so that's not obviously a socialist, thing. And then also report that they they had what was an indigenization bill, which required at least 51% of shares of any companies, particularly in the mines, to be owned by indigenous people or Africans, right? Now, this is not nationalization of the mines, which we discussed how complicated those kind of things can be. But it was something that was positive. Now they're talking about reversing that, except for when it comes to the mines of gold and diamonds and platinum. And so they're saying that some of these other things, most of these other things, if not all of them, will not be subject to this indigenization bill, which means anyone, even foreign investors, can come in and own and dominate the shares in these companies. Now, a socialist program, revolutionary program, will prefer and rather these things actually not even just the indigenization bill, but to be nationalized, so that the resources so that the yields from them and the resources can be applied to address basic human needs, much like what Venezuela is trying to do with its oil companies. And so, so these are the things that are concerning right now, and why we should pay attention to them, and the complexity of it, because those of us who have yet to succeed in a revolution will be having to face some of these things. I'm talking about people around the world in other countries and whatnot, or even if we were to, get some nominal liberated zones or something within this country, we have to face these conditions of either we manage a capitalism, which we can see where, Cooperation Jackson is raising some of these, and Jackson is raising these difficulties, whether we put ourselves in a position to have to manage what is already the status quo, a disposition when it comes to economy, or whether we can create something altogether new that really benefits humanity in a more just and equitable way. And so that's my...
Look, it's also a reminder of, for us here and other parts of the diaspora, of our still evolving need to clearly define what we mean by revolution, change. What does it mean, especially coming out of 8 years of Obama here? What does it mean to have been told this was change, this was revolution, this is hope, as opposed to what it really means to develop a sustainable revolutionary society? And then also the point that it can't just be in one location. And this is always the struggle of revolutionaries all over the world, that as you started off, and Nkrumah taught us this as well as anybody else, that it can't just be one country getting free, so-called, because there's so many other interconnected economies and peoples and issues and politics. And then lastly, I did want to, you mentioned something about foreign influence or involvement in taking over the industries and land or this indigenization project. The Western press is reporting that China might be involved or behind the so-called coup or shift, and we know that they're one of the major investors in the continent as a whole. But I did want to ask, I did mean to ask you in this conversation to say a word or two about China and their involvement both in Zimbabwe and in this change of power, but also in the continent itself. But anyway, and then anything else?
Right. So I'm glad you asked me that. That's pretty important. Now, this is also the Western press is doing that because they're preoccupied with the influence of China around the world, and so they've been concerned with China's influence or their dealings in Africa for a long time. Now, one thing that people should understand when it comes to Zimbabwe, another part that they didn't like during the whole structural adjustment, jettisoning and land was Zimbabwe's look east policy. They've always had actually relationships with China and other countries for a long time, and particularly China's relationship during the liberation struggle. China was assisting, was more of assistance than anything. So we have to look at that. And then, but the look east policy was one that was strengthening and looking to China because they don't put the kind of conditions that imperialism puts on a country. And so that was always there. When it comes to them saying having something to do in the coup, they might be referring to the report where they were saying I'm sorry, I'm really bad with these names, who was the general in charge of the defense, was in China. So also Mnangagwa had also met him in China. But in China, they said that they reported that they asked them, it was said by Reuters, how much we can, depend on this, I don't really know, that they asked China, if they, in fact, they took over from Mugabe, would they intervene? I mean, because, you know, their relationship has been mostly with Mugabe and the leadership there. So they wanted to know if they were intervene in their affairs. And they said, no, we would not interfere in what happens there. And we would, you know, continue to work with whoever's in power. Now, that to me is not, you know, that's not helping with the coup, obviously. And it also is much more of a reasonable thing. If you're talking about sovereignty and whatnot, you know, what else are you going to say? No, we're going to come in there and we can't, you know, so if anything, that's what they're talking about. There's no evidence whatsoever that they actually helped them with any kind of coup or anything, and they would have no reason to do that. It was nothing, you know, their interest would be to continue, could just have to continue with the relationship with whoever's in power.
Well, Netfa Freeman, I appreciate you taking the time to help us take this little bit of a slow walk through all of these issues. Go ahead. No, finish.
Well, last thing, point is we should be very, no matter what happens, our position of not being in Zimbabweans should be for the sanctions to be lifted. They're unjust. Of course, it's up to Zimbabweans to make sure that they're lifted without compromising anything. You know, like we, you know, the stands we see in Cuba and everything, but we should be supporting an unconditional lifting of sanctions and non-interference in not just Zimbabwe but around the world. And so I think that's very important to make sure we keep.
Well, I agree, and as a non-expert on the issue, I have always just rested on the point I raised earlier that we can't be. Or our criticism can't start and stop or be overly focused on any individual leader or president within any of these countries, Zimbabwe chief among them, without first looking at their relationship to international capital, to Western empire, et cetera, and so forth, because it is those dominant forces that have more to say about what happens in any given country than any given leader does. So whatever imperfections there may have been, and one that we didn't get to in this conversation that you mentioned in your piece is that you know, the transition strategy that Mugabe maybe could have tightened up a little bit, as we have seen done better elsewhere, Cuba in particular. But regardless of all of that, until this question of the people who, as we said earlier, can whisper the demise of your economy is addressed,
it's hard to judge them.
And then as I just quickly look, I mean, I meant for us to get to this at least a little bit, you know, when we look at why this country is still important to the global economy. I mean, we just look at, you know, not a lot of people realize why the West is so intent on being involved, or why China would want to be involved in the continent of Africa. But just Zimbabwe alone is, you know, a major producer of stones, metals, tobacco, as you pointed out, platinum, gold, diamonds, nickel, clay, cement, steel. I mean, oil. I mean, there's so much. There's a lot going on that makes Zimbabwe and other parts of Africa still a prize for Western and non-African entities. But anyway, I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through. And as long as this conversation has been, it has been insufficient and very short. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for your work with PACA, and we'll have you back to talk more about that as well, and invite people to check that out as well. But Netfa Freeman, thanks again for joining us. And as Fred Hampton used to say, to you, we say peace as we know you're willing to fight for it, and we say the same to everybody else. And thanks again for joining us. I mix what I like.